Welcome! Previously, I have talked about the Russian invasion and Western sanctions that were supposed to ruin Putin's regime. In the last few months, more such sanctions have been imposed on the Russian economy and prominent political figures, so it's time to take a look at their intended and actual effects. As usual, we see a discrepancy here. The real question is, who benefits from these decisions? In 2014, following the occupation of Crimea, 3 rounds of sanctions were announced by the EU, targeting Russian individuals, companies, and segments of the economy. In 2022, once the invasion commenced, 2 more rounds followed, while officials continued talks on the 6th package. This time around, more countries, even some Asian states, joined. Foreign exchange reserves of the Russian Central Bank and other bank assets were frozen. Some banks were excluded from SWIFT, the international transaction messaging system, but European, mainly German, opposition ensured that gas payments were excluded from such measures. Both Canada and the US banned oil imports, which was a largely symbolic move as they didn't really need such imports, but they also introduced export controls on high-tech products and intellectual property. Russian yachts were impounded. Many companies like Visa and MasterCard kicked Russian customers off their platforms to wreck the Russian economy, cause a bank run, after which the invasion would have to be stopped. Right from the start, opposition mounted. Although Hungary is often listed as the sole opponent, thanks to its energetic nationalist prime minister, Viktor Orbán, in reality, several countries doubted the validity of the mainstream argument. French, German, and Italian politicians and businesspersons voiced their concerns, not to mention several Southern and Eastern European leaders who wanted to avoid serious damage to their own economies. Some companies, like Lufthansa and Siemens, had attempted to circumvent these sanctions before, but once the invasion of Ukraine started this year, Western countries adopted a more unified tone, most likely due to American pressure. The Russian ruble and the stock market tanked in February and March, the latter falling by 39%, while the former sank to record lows. The government intervened, interest rates were raised to 20%, but many companies divested their Russian assets, and the country was also hit by mass emigration and cyber attacks. However, by the end of March, the ruble recovered its previous losses, and the war continued. In April, the 5th package of sanctions arrived, targeting more individuals, 4 key Russian banks, and economic sectors like energy, finance, media, and defense, but Russian vessels were also banned from EU ports, while Ukraine received more weapons and intelligence data from the West. Globally, inflation started to appear, with levels not seen in the previous 2 decades. This was partly the result of the war and the sanctions, since both Russia and Ukraine are important sources of wheat and raw materials, but we should not forget that governments and central banks had dropped lots of easy and also free money on people during the pandemic. Unlike monetary easing in the previous decade, these measures were highly inflationary, boosting lending and consumer demand. Supply constraints due to the war and the sanctions just added fuel to the fire. Inflation soon overshot official targets. The emphasis gradually moved to Russian gas and oil shipments, which basically sustained Europe, satisfying its massive energy needs. Oil prices started going up in late February. This was reinforced by the North American oil ban and news regarding a possible European move, although the Russian Urals benchmark declined, as 60% of their oil exports go to Europe. It was not surprising that China immediately started buying up cheap Russian oil. We can be sure that other countries followed their example, so Russia actually benefited, taking in as much revenue from oil in the first 4 months as it did in the whole year in 2021. This way, Putin could easily finance the war and also implement new welfare measures to maintain his popularity. Even though more than 150 Western companies halted their Russian operations, crippling the country's economy would not happen. The population closed ranks and continued to support their president, as they had always done before, in hard times. Patriotism and pride should not be underestimated. Those who thought Russia could be broken by imposing economic hardship should have read a few history books. New estimates show that Russia's economy will contract this year by 11%, which is a huge hit, but it will not lead to a collapse. Ukraine will suffer a lot more. The decline may reach 45% on an annual basis, partly because its economy is smaller and weaker, but also because most of the destruction takes place there. Energy remains a very important question. More than 1 million people lost access to power in Ukraine in the first few weeks. 6 million have fled the country, while internally another 8 million had to relocate, becoming internal refugees. They are more than welcome in most European countries. We have not seen news regarding discrimination or negative attitudes towards fleeing Ukrainians. Many of them have already found employment in neighboring countries, where labor shortage was a problem. Meanwhile, negotiations continued in the European Union regarding the next step, which would include a ban on Russian oil imports. This is a tricky question since many European countries rely on continued Russian oil and gas deliveries, which could only be replaced with much more expensive American LNG and oil from either the Gulf or the US. Obviously, higher cost and a lack of infrastructure are a big problem. The real question is whether Europe wants to pay a lot more for energy imports. Interestingly, nobody seems to care about environmental concerns, even though it's obvious that overseas deliveries are not exactly environmentally friendly. As usual, politics overrides everything, power relations determine the eventual outcome, so it's no surprise that Europe once again shoots itself in the foot, while the US benefits as it can sell more of its energy to eager customers. After supposedly tough negotiations, the sixth round of sanctions were announced in late May, just as I was writing this script. The oil embargo is now in, but it excludes pipeline oil, so that countries like Hungary, Slovakia, and Czechia can continue providing energy to their populace. Interestingly, nobody mentions Germany or Austria, who also receive pipeline oil from Russia. I'm absolutely sure they will stop now, as they are just and pure and honorable members of the European Union, unlike evil Hungary and Slovakia. At the same time, Sberbank is also excluded from SWIFT, free Russian media platforms are banned, and adding pipeline oil to the package towards the end of the year is possible. Natural gas is not included. At the moment, there is no alternative to Russian gas, since only about 20% of Europe's need is met by overseas LNG shipments. The continent needs more LNG terminals, pipelines connecting those terminals to existing networks, and a lot more money to replace the Russian source. It's also clear that weapons manufacturers profit greatly from the conflict. Their stock prices have been going up consistently. Western stockpiles are being emptied as more and more arms are sent to Ukraine. These stockpiles have to be replenished, which comes at a great cost to Western countries, but it's great business for companies like Raytheon, BAE Systems, etc. While new taxes are being introduced on profits at oil and gas companies, see the British government's new announcement, for some reason nobody is trying to curb the extra profit in the arms industry, which continues to improve its own bottom line, in the name of democracy and freedom, of course. We don't know whether the new EU package will be enough to tie Russia's hands. It's likely that China, Turkey, Serbia, and other countries will continue buying more Russian oil. Gas shipments to Europe will continue, while the usual half-hearted EU decisions contain loopholes that not only Hungary, but other countries will try to use to their advantage. Once again, the real questions are not being discussed in mainstream media. Europe needs more time and more money to replace Russian oil and gas. Its positions will further weaken due to this great change. The US will improve its own position in the game of geopolitics, while Russia will most likely endure and continue its war in Ukraine. Talking heads on TV can blame Orban for everything, but they should look at who else is behind Orban, who else is trying to avoid a full embargo and cutting all ties with Russia, and who really benefits from the war. The likely suspects are not in Eastern Europe. Thank you for watching. See you next time.